The last person to see Evelyn Marsh alive swore she was softly humming a lullaby as she locked up the old radio station in Pelican Bay. That was October 17th, 1942, at precisely 11:38 p.m. By dawn, Evelyn Marsh had vanished from the earth, as if she'd never been there at all, leaving not even a footprint behind. Before we step any deeper into this mystery, if you're intrigued by tales where the truth lingers in the shadows for decades, make sure to follow this journey. You won't want to miss where this investigation leads. Pelican Bay, a small coastal town in Oregon in the autumn of 1942, was a place where secrets could only hide for so long, or so everyone believed. The radio station perched at the edge of town like a weather-beaten lighthouse, its paint flaking and battered by storms. Evelyn Marsh, 24 years old, had worked there for almost 3 years as the night signal operator, a job that paid $15 a week, and demanded she work alone in the studio from 6 in the evening until midnight, 6 nights a week. She was slight, with auburn hair always tied back in a neat bun, and the locals described her as gentle and genuine, the type who hosted church bake sales and never once caused trouble. That particular October night was unusually cold for the Pacific Coast. Evelyn left home wearing her blue wool coat, the one with mismatched silver buttons her younger brother Simon had sewn on after the originals disappeared. She kissed her father goodbye at 5:30, grabbed her lunch tin with 2 chicken sandwiches and an orange, and pedaled her black Raleigh bicycle down the foggy road toward the radio station, the same path she'd followed hundreds of times before. The bike was her pride, a black Raleigh with shining chrome bars, a graduation gift from her mother before illness claimed her life 2 years prior. The station manager, Arthur Bentley, aged 54 and long widowed, had overseen the radio station for nearly 2 decades. When Evelyn arrived for her evening shift, Arthur was already there. He later told Sheriff Lawrence Howard that everything had been normal that night. Evelyn had logged in, checked the broadcasting equipment, and settled into her familiar routine, relaying local news, playing jazz records, and reading scheduled weather reports. Arthur left at 7, as usual, leaving Evelyn alone in the dimly lit studio, with only the red glow of the on-air lamp for company and the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore. At 11:38 p.m., Evelyn's voice signed off the last news report of the evening, a brief update on a passing coastal storm. The night watchman at the lighthouse, a mile down the beach, would later recall that her tone was calm and pleasant, betraying no sign of distress. She ended the broadcast with her trademark, "Good night, Pelican Bay." Then the airwaves fell silent. From that moment onward, whatever took place in the small radio station would become one of Oregon's most chilling mysteries. When Evelyn's father, Jack Marsh, awoke at 6 a.m. and saw her bed undisturbed, alarm gripped his chest. She had never once failed to return home after her shift. Jack bundled himself in an old fisherman's coat and hurried through the pre-dawn mist, his breath puffing white in the cold air as he walked the mile to the station. He tried to convince himself that there must be some ordinary explanation. The door to the station was locked from the outside. Evelyn's bicycle rested against the side wall, exactly where she always left it, untouched, the morning dew still clinging to the seat and handles. But Evelyn was gone. Inside, he found the small studio perfectly in order. The microphone was switched off, the records neatly stacked, Evelyn's lunch tin sitting by the soundboard sandwiches untouched, the orange with only one bite missing. Her coat and purse were nowhere to be found, but there was no note, no evidence of violence, no sign that anything was amiss. It was as if Evelyn Marsh had merely stepped into the night and melted into the chilly Pacific mist, leaving no more trace than the morning fog. Sheriff Lawrence Howard had worn his badge for over 15 years when Jack Marsh burst into his office, eyes wild with fear and confusion. Howard was a practical man of 50, hair gone mostly gray, his voice steady from years of calming, anxious townsfolk. He'd handled missing persons cases before, usually runaways or drunks who wandered off to the next port. But Jack's panic unsettled him from the start. By 8 that morning, Howard had assembled a search party of 20 locals. They fanned out from the radio station in widening arcs, combing along the rocky beach, searching the wind-bent pine groves, and calling for Evelyn until their voices cracked. They checked the tide pools, climbed the cliffs near the lighthouse, and even searched the burned-out cannery, where drifters sometimes sheltered from the elements. They found nothing, not so much as a thread from her blue wool coat, not a footprint in the sand, not a mark by the shore. It was as if Evelyn Marsh had been plucked from the earth by unseen hands. Sheriff Howard's first move was to question Arthur Bentley, the station manager. He was the last confirmed person to see Evelyn alive. In Howard's experience, that fact alone warranted close scrutiny. Arthur lived in a modest, weathered house near Pelican Bay's small harbor, a place set apart from the clapboard homes clustered around Main Street. His wife, Clara, had died years before, and Arthur had become a fixture about town, his routines as regular as the tides. Howard sat across from him 3 evenings after Evelyn's disappearance, both men shrouded in cigarette smoke and tension. Arthur's hands trembled slightly as he answered questions. Yes, he'd left the station at 7 as always, walked home through the chill, eaten cold beans and bread for dinner, listened to his battered radio, and gone to bed. He hadn't seen anyone hanging around near the station, nor had he noticed anything unusual about Evelyn's mood. He was adamant. Nothing strange on the trains that week either. No unfamiliar passengers alighting at Pelican Bay. Yet, Howard noticed Arthur's gaze sometimes drifted off, failing to meet his own. The station manager seemed preoccupied, his fingers nervously tapping the arm of his chair. The sheriff made note of it, but there was no real evidence, nothing concrete he could act upon. 3 days into the search, another name surfaced. Clara Sykes, a reclusive shopkeeper on Lighthouse Road, mentioned to a deputy she'd seen a stranger in town the afternoon Evelyn went missing, a man who'd asked about odd jobs. He didn't linger, vanishing soon after sunset. But in a place like Pelican Bay, any outsider spelled suspicion. The stranger was described as in his early 30s, haggard from travel, with a patchy beard and clothes stiff from salt water. The townsfolk called him the Logger. The sheriff tracked him down on the outskirts of town, living rough among battered fishing shacks and driftwood fires. The Logger, whose real name was James Wyatt, was used to suspicion. He met questions with wary resignation. Yes, he admitted, he had been in Pelican Bay that week, but he'd left before nightfall to reach a freight train bound further north. He'd spent the night camping with 2 other itinerant workers, both men, when found, vouched for his story with stoic nods and sea-worn hands. With no indication the Logger had ever been near the radio station that night, Sheriff Howard had to let him go. The hollow chill of failure set in. He would think of Wyatt years later, wonder if desperation had made him too quick to accept an alibi. As October turned to November, the search parties dwindled. Routines reclaimed the townsfolk. Boats needed mending. The cannery demanded workers, and winter's wind sharpened off the ocean. But Jack Marsh refused to rest. He tramped the tide pools and cliff paths alone, calling for his daughter, with nothing but the seagulls to answer. 4 weeks after Evelyn's disappearance, during a blustery dusk, a letter arrived at the Marsh home. Young Simon Marsh fetched it from the mail slot, hands trembling with cold, and ran to his father. The postmark read, Portland, November 10, 1942. But the handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Evelyn's precise and fluid, just as she had learned in correspondence class at school. Jack opened it with shaking hands. The note inside was brief, almost formal. Evelyn wrote that she was leaving Pelican Bay of her own free will. She described being unable to endure the suffocating rhythms of small-town life and craved escape. Something new. There was mention of meeting someone, a figure who had promised her adventure, and a promise that she would write again once settled. "Please do not worry or search for me," she closed, signing her full name, Evelyn Rose Marsh. Sheriff Howard studied the letter by lamplight later that night. The signature matched samples in Evelyn's room shopping lists and a faded birthday card. Objectively, everything looked authentic, but Jack Marsh would not be convinced. He sat across from Howard, voice rough with grief. "My girl would never leave town without saying goodbye. Never send a note like that." Sheriff Howard had seen such cases before. War, poverty, the temptations of the city. Sometimes even the best young women ran away. Perhaps Evelyn had finally tired of the constraints of Pelican Bay. Or perhaps something else. But there were troubling details. Evelyn's gold necklace, a pendant she wore every day, a gift from her late mother, was left on her nightstand. Her savings, nearly $80, untouched in a tin can in her closet. What young woman, truly starting a new life, would abandon those? The note, while in Evelyn's hand, was cold, devoid of her usual warmth. Howard sensed a puzzle. The right handwriting, the wrong voice. He sent the note to handwriting analysts in Salem. The result came back 2 weeks later. The handwriting was consistent with genuine samples. No evidence of a forgery, the expert wrote. The case officially was closed. But Simon Marsh noticed something that kept him lying awake at night. His sister had always signed official papers as E.R. Marsh. Always. Here, for the first time, she'd written Evelyn Rose Marsh in full. In the Marsh house, hope and sorrow lived side by side as the days blurred past, and outside, the wind never seemed to stop howling over the empty shell of the radio station. Winter arrived hard along the Oregon coast that year, as Evelyn's case faded from headlines. Pelican Bay's Main Street returned to its rhythms, but the Marsh family's world became frozen in that October night. Jack Marsh, once known for his salty jokes and easy laughter down at the docks, drifted through town like a ghost, barely mumbling greetings. Simon found refuge in chores, spending long hours at the family's small repair shop, but every so often he would catch sight of a flash of auburn hair in a crowd, and his heart would pound, hope surging only to be crushed again. Rumors and theories ran wild. Some whispered that Evelyn had eloped with a mysterious sailor. Others imagined a tragic accident on the cliffs, her body swallowed by the Pacific. The church ladies organized prayer circles and bake sales for the Marshes, but beneath their smiles lingered questions they dared not voice. In a town where everyone knew everyone, her absence left a raw, invisible wound. The radio station, shuttered after Evelyn's disappearance, became first a symbol of loss and then a target for speculation. Children dared one another to sneak up to its dusty porch late at night. A few claimed to see a pale woman at the microphone, trailing static instead of words, an apparition doomed to haunt the airwaves. Jack and Simon never stopped searching. On weekends, they scoured the coastline and neighboring towns for any sign of Evelyn. Her case was kept alive by a weekly notice in the Pelican Bay Gazette, paid for at first by Jack, then reprinted free by old editor Muldoon after Jack's savings ran dry. Evelyn Rose Marsh missing since October 17, 1942. If you know anything, contact the Marsh family. No one ever did. By spring, both the town and the authorities moved on. War gripped the nation's attention. The Marsh's home grew quieter, the walls heavy with what-ifs and ghostly echoes. Even Simon eventually left, taking seasonal work on distant fishing boats, unable to stand the emptiness. Jack remained, maintaining an unchanging vigil. He repainted Evelyn's bedroom every year, kept her bicycle polished, and chain oiled, and placed fresh flowers on her unused pillow. Decades slipped by. In Pelican Bay, the story of Evelyn's vanishing shrank to a warning for young girls and a legend whispered beside campfires. Some swore the wind through the old radio station still sounded like a woman humming. In 1967, the property was sold. A developer announced plans for a new apartment block. The radio station, neglected and battered by storms, was finally scheduled for demolition. As workers hauled away debris, they unearthed a heap of ancient cables, shattered records, and, to their horror, a rotting leather satchel buried beneath the concrete soundstage. Inside was a tangle of brittle papers, and shockingly, Evelyn's blue wool coat, still bearing one of the mismatched buttons Simon had sewn on decades earlier. Stuck deep in the coat's lining was a fragment of stationery, faint lines of barely legible handwriting preserved by luck and dryness. Sheriff Howard Long, retired and frail, was fetched to the site, his hands shaking as he examined the relics in the shadow of his own failures. The note contained only a few words. "He's watching me. Please, if I disappear, ask Arthur Bentley." The town was plunged into a second storm of speculation and anguish. Sheriff Howard, his mind still sharp despite the years, felt the world tilt beneath him. Had Arthur Bentley, the kindly and mournful station manager, known more than he'd ever admitted? Had the answers been right in front of him, written in fear all those years ago? The answers, it seemed, were buried deeper than anyone believed, and some secrets were only beginning to surface. The discovery of the satchel sent a ripple through every corner of Pelican Bay. The sight of Evelyn's long-lost coat and the fear-soaked note reignited suspicions and old wounds. The new sheriff, Gina Ellsworth, was young but determined not to repeat the mistakes of her predecessors. She immediately reopened the case, determined to follow every thread, even those long cold. First, she visited Arthur Bentley, now 80 and living quietly on the edge of a windswept marsh. He looked diminished, his once bright eyes clouded with the passage of years. Gina brought the old blue coat and the scrap of writing. Arthur's hands shook as he held them, staring in pained silence. "I didn't hurt her," he murmured more to himself than the sheriff. "But I should have listened better. I should have protected her." Under gentle questioning, Arthur revealed that for months before Evelyn vanished, she had confided her unease. A man, someone she would not name, had been following her after work, leaving strange notes at the studio. Evelyn had tried to dismiss them, believing she was overreacting, but her fear had grown. Arthur, racked with guilt, admitted he had shrugged off her concerns. "I thought it was just sailors being brash. Stupid of me. I should have stayed that night." A team searched the station's remains more thoroughly now, using modern forensic techniques. Beneath layers of dust and salt, they unearthed a thin box containing several of the anonymous notes. The handwriting, starkly different from Evelyn's, threatened violence in cryptic phrases. "You are not safe. Your voice belongs to me." Police also discovered in the engineer's logbook one undated entry made by an unfamiliar hand. "After midnight. Alone. Soon. M." Sheriff Ellsworth sent the recovered letters and Evelyn's note to a handwriting analyst in Portland, along with the old runaway letter for new comparison. The results were staggering. The threatening notes and the fake letter home were written by the same person. A meticulous forgery, but the same hand. Analysis pointed to Michael Carter, a former sound technician at the station who had disappeared shortly after Evelyn did. Carter's name, long forgotten, returned suddenly to relevance. The town buzzed with speculation. Carter had been a reserved, polite young man, his presence so unremarkable that he'd faded into the background. But investigators dug up evidence of a quiet obsession. Several local women recalled Carter staring at Evelyn during late-night broadcasts or lingering around the station's back entrance. It was a case with no living suspect. No one had heard from Carter since late '42. He'd left Pelican Bay quietly, and any trail had long since gone cold. But closure finally began to seep into the long, aching wounds of the Marsh family and the town. Evelyn's parents, long since passed, would never know the truth. Simon, now gray and stooped himself, attended a public memorial at the rebuilt radio plaza, where townsfolk gathered for a quiet ceremony beneath a plaque honoring Evelyn's memory. He spoke only once that cold evening, his voice steady for the first time in many years. Secrets can drown in the tides and be blown away by time and wind. But the truth, once found, can finally let ghosts rest. I never stopped calling for my sister, and I pray she finally heard me. As the townspeople drifted home, Pelican Bay felt lighter, a burden lifted, if not entirely erased. The waves still roared against the rocks, the wind still sang through the dunes, but at last, the story of Evelyn Marsh belonged not to fear or rumor, but to memory and peace. Years have passed since the final secrets of Evelyn Marsh's disappearance were laid bare. Pelican Bay, weathered as ever by wind and salt, remains a small mosaic of untold stories and proud traditions. The apartment block built over the old radio station hosts families with no memory of that long-ago mystery. Children play along the shoreline, laughter echoing where once the town only whispered in fear. But some remnants of the past remain. At the edge of the coastal plaza stands a bronze plaque, simple but strong, inscribed with the words, "In memory of Evelyn Rose." Marsh, 1918 to 1942, a voice that brought light to the darkness, never forgotten. Locals still pause beside it on foggy mornings, placing wildflowers or simply standing in silent thought. Simon Marsh has long since found peace. His own children and grandchildren sometimes visit, holding his hand and asking about the aunt they never met. He tells them that Evelyn loved the sea above all else, and that secrets, no matter how deep, can be brought to shore if we dare to search. The story of Evelyn Marsh is no longer a ghost tale to frighten children or a warning against the unknown. It has become, instead, a quiet lesson about listening to those we love, believing their fears, and never allowing silence to hide the truth. In Pelican Bay, the wind and waves still carry echoes of the past, but now, when they tell the story of Evelyn, it is a story of hope and the hard-won peace that comes when mysteries are finally laid to rest. So when you visit small towns, remember, behind every shuttered door, every faded photograph, there may be a voice waiting to be heard, a mystery longing for the truth. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen and to keep calling out into the darkness until the answer finally comes back on the wind.